Hey, this is your host Chris, and with me is my co-host Rob. Welcome to another episode of Crappy Reviews, a channel all about helping you shed some light on your favorite shows. To keep up to date with the new clues as we find them, be sure to follow us on social media, and if you enjoy what you hear, take a second to hit the like button so we and the algorithm know we're on the right track. I hope you enjoy this realities episode. Let's jump in.
What is up, astronauts, cosmonauts, and everyone else tuning in, and welcome to the wild world, or worlds, of Constellation. So by this point in the series, we know the show is based on quantum mechanics and the premise of multiple realities. But most prominently of those is probably the Double-slit Experiment. Chris, for those who might not know, or are even just a little more curious, tell us what that is on a high level for everybody.
So if you've never heard of this experiment, please go look it up in a detailed video. It is fascinating. But in a nutshell, the double-slit experiment suggests that particles exist in a state of superposition. Superposition allows for an electron to exist in multiple states simultaneously. So it's like having multiple outcomes coexisting at the same time. Until they're observed, in which case they decide on a position to be, which is the observer effect that Henry refers to throughout the show.
So, Chris, you used the word superposition there. Another really famous experiment that I think a lot of people would be able to pull on their memory from that deals with superposition is the Schrödinger's cat experiment, if y'all have heard of that one before, which really is, we know the cat is inside the box, but there's two different outcomes, like Chris said about the electrons on the other side. There's multiple outcomes that could be there. Is the cat still living, or has the cat unfortunately met its demise inside the box? And obviously, I think, and Chris, I'll let you elaborate on a little bit more, we see some really strong potential similarities here with the Schrodinger's cat experiment and this TV show, aside from the fact of the dead cat on the floor in the cabin, which, little subtle hint there, I think, maybe.
Yeah, so the dead cat on the floor of the cabin is definitely, it alerted us pretty early on to the parallels of Schrodinger's cat in the show. And most likely the dead cat in the cabin means that that's the reality that Joe died in, because like Rob was saying, the parallels in the show are that Joe is the cat and the capsule is the box, and people in mission control and us, the audience, are the observers waiting to see if the cat is alive or dead. And up until that point that we hear from her on the mic, on the radio, or they open up the capsule, she is living and dead at the same time. She's essentially in two states. There's two versions of her coexisting at the same time. Now, the theory is more of a thought experiment, and the cat obviously isn't alive and dead at the same time. But in the show, they're taking this theory to the extreme, and we find out that there is a version of her that is alive and there is a version of her that's dead. So the Schrodinger's cat experiment is played out right in front of us on the show. And then for further clarification, if the dead cat on the floor of the cabin and the general layout of the scene wasn't enough, episode 4, we see Bud talking to Henry, I guess on webcam, kind of, probably not. But they're talking to each other, and Bud turns to look at Joe and then, ominously tells her that curiosity killed the cat, referring to her as the cat again in this scenario. So it's pretty obvious by the end of episode 4 that the Schrödinger experiment was what was happening in the first couple episodes that we saw.
Yeah, and to that point, we're starting to see, I think, in this episode 4 specifically, what we think is it's kind of playing out the two different possible timelines, and that's what we're seeing here. So in a way, it's an interpretation of the many worlds theory, which I know is something Chris is super into. He's a really big fan of the many worlds theory, but part of that being some of our realities can be so similar to each other that you almost wouldn't notice when you go back and forth. But unfortunately, it appears like Joe has arrived back in the incorrect reality.
Correct. So I do love the many worlds theory. I just think it's fascinating to begin with. And I think that might be part of the answer for the show from on MGM Plus. So I've thought about it a lot for this show, for that show.
Shout out from.
Yeah,
shout out
I
from
was already
MGM
kind of
Plus.
investigating for that show. And then when Constellation showed up and it dealt with that, I was like, oh, great, I'm already a leg up. So the many worlds theory by Hugh Everett, which he came up with in 1955, is an answer to the double-slit experiment, because once they shoot these particles out and they're in a state of superposition, which, like we said, is basically all the versions of where these particles could go all exist at the same time until someone looks at them and then they pick their final destination. The many worlds theory is basically saying that today I woke up and I decided to make a cup of coffee and then go about my day. And then I got into a fender bender and all kinds of stuff happened. And then another reality, the second that I had that cup of coffee, I did not have the cup of coffee and I left a little bit earlier and I didn't have this happen. So for every decision you make, another reality branches off for a decision that you didn't make, the opposite effect. And most of these are indistinguishable from each other. You know, they're not very different, as you could see in the show. The only reason we know is because the affair or a few other, they seem big for the show, but in real life wouldn't be like cataclysmic. They weren't like 9/11 level events that happen in one reality or the other.
Right. Buying a blue car instead of a red car,
Right.
for example.
And so the many worlds theory is one answer to how you could have multiple realities happen at the same time. Now, interestingly, they in real life, this theory postulates that you don't communicate with the two universes. They may exist, but we don't ever meet, so it's inconsequential. But in this show, clearly that's not the case. One, the Cal experiment, after Henry explains it, the goal of it was to open up a stable way for the two realities to communicate or send information and not just be what looks like happenstance now. And it must have obviously happened to Henry and Irina. I think we kind of already know that. And
Agreed.
Other astronauts and pilots have been experiencing this too because of Henry's conversation. So the many worlds theory seems to be the route they're taking, or at least an interpretation of that theory.
And so that Cal experiment, we've seen this whole show set up in a way where, hey, space was kind of the main focus, right? With Constellation as the title and everything. But we really feel like we're thinking the conditions within space were just so perfect to do the experiment as well. And that's why we're seeing these effects on Joe and Henry / Bud, Irina. They're the ones that have been kind of experiencing the observer effect, because all of this has to happen within the conditions of space more so than it being a key part of the plot. But if in my mind and my theory that if we were able to perfectly replicate the conditions and that zero gravity experience for the test, that it could potentially happen on Earth too. So I think that's a big part of what Henry's been looking at himself to try and tap into this, as he called it, new form of matter. But to this point, I still think that was kind of a misnomer, or at least an intentional misnaming to get the test up and running on the ISS.
Yeah, they probably could tie it back at one point and explain how it is new form of matter. But to your point, my understanding when he was done explaining it with all the crystals and such was that he wants to be able to communicate and go back and forth and not just have it be wishy-washy. And so I agree that the reason he needs to do it up in space, in my opinion, is because they can't recreate the exact zero gravity conditions on Earth. So it seems like when you're in space, in those conditions, you have more fluidity between the realities. So it looks like this happens all the time. In our current reality, in the one that we're talking in right now, and they invoke the Mandela effect when they're at dinner.
Nelson Mandela has a Swedish half-brother.
Who's Nelson Mandela?
It's not going to work if you don't know who Nelson Mandela is.
I know who he was.
For those of you who don't know what it is, which I'm sure everybody here does, Nelson Mandela died in the 2000s. But if you ask a huge swath of the population, they'll say he died in the 1980s, and that they remember the funeral and they remember all the stuff that happened and the big procession and everything as much as you remember your last birthday. It was as clear as could be. And so the Mandela effect is when a large group of people misremember an event, a TV show, something from the media, something substantial that a whole bunch, not just me and Rob and two other people, like if you had 10,000 people, 5,000 would say that he died and 5,000 would say he lived till the 2000s. They invoke this in the show. And the reason that seems important is because it tells me that all the stuff that happens around the world that people think is the Mandela effect and is just misremembering are actually realities glitching all the time. But you're not in space and you didn't have a Cal up there to loosen up the liminal space between realities for you to actually flow through like Joe and Paul, Henry, Irina did. So it seems like when you're on Earth and you're the pilot in the plane where the wind gets pushed and some other stuff, or you misremember Mirror, Mirror on the Wall, or the Monopoly Man, or whatever, the Sinbad, which did happen, by the way.
Yeah, real quick. So the way Chris loves the many worlds theory, the Mandela effect might be my favorite weird. I don't even want to call it scientific, but just like effect theory, whatever you want to call it. It might be my favorite one to look into. To his point, there was no Shazam movie with Sinbad, as much as Chris tries to say so. A lot of people think of Jif peanut butter as Jiffy. To his point, the Monopoly Man did not have a monocle, even though that seems to be
Curious George didn't have a tail.
Curious George didn't have a tail. The one that always got me as well, the Berenstein Bears. It's not the Berenstein Bears. It's the Berenstain Bears with an A. Whole thing. But millions of people. So to his point,
Hold
people
on.
are still
Wait 1 second. I want people in the comments to say yes, Sinbad was in Shazam, or no, Sinbad was not in Shazam, because I'm 100% sure Sinbad was in Shazam. So I may have glitched out somewhere in like the 90s,
No,
and that's
it's
why
not
I
that
think that.
It's not that you glitched out. It's that it did exist. And the Sinbad they're asking now is who glitched into ours. Maybe that's what it is.
So
but
anyway,
to your point,
yeah.
all the Sinbad joking aside, as Sinbad in a genie costume, we're looking at, to your point, Chris, millions of people and everyone across the face of the earth experiencing small bits and pieces of these multiple many worlds in their real life without really realizing it. And a big piece of that, again, now we're seeing who can slip through. And that's a lot of what we're seeing in this show. So
it looks like a few people did slip through. Okay, so once Joe gets back, and there's a million different little nuances that are different, right? She was having an affair with Frederick in one reality, and she didn't in the other. Alice doesn't speak Swedish fluently in one or the other. A million different things. The red and blue car. When you see their house in the first scene, it's from the left. When you see it when she gets back, it's from the right. All kinds of things like that. So there's a million different things that she's coming across. She gets back to her house and things are going fairly well. And then she realizes there's a piano in the house and she doesn't play piano, except she can. So why do we think that is?
I'm going to first say I remember watching the trailer for the show and seeing that included in the trailer and thinking it was a little bit funny, because not having the context of the show, watching her face react to her own hands play the piano seemed a bit funny. I'm not going to lie, but with the extra context of seeing us in the show, I do think it was a really great scene to really drive home this flipping back and forth, if you will. And I think it's the more time, and I know Chris is something you've specifically said too, the more time she's spending in this reality that might not be hers, I'll use air quotes on that, right? But it's not her reality. She's starting to morph and form a little bit into the Joe of this reality, getting some of those memories, abilities, and giving her the ability to play the piano when she never could before.
Yeah, I agree. I think the longer she stays in that reality, the more that consciousness is going to take over and she'll just become that Joe. I'd be interested if she starts to forget stuff as the series goes on and not just gain information, which is what we're getting now. She's learning how to do stuff, but we haven't seen her forget things. And it'd be interesting if we saw her forget something that we knew from per episode she did already know. That would kind of solidify that theory that we just have there. So just before we talk about some of the other interesting things that we've noticed, things to keep an eye out for, I just want to say what makes this show interesting for me is that they introduced the multiverse, which has become pretty common since the MCU, since Marvel started doing it. It's been a trope, in a lot of media since they've done it. But what's interesting is the mechanism that they're using to explain it is real. These theories are real. Quantum mechanics is real. These experiments are real. All the science they've talked about so far, although they're taking the results, they're taking the theoretical results of what it could mean literally in the show. The theories and the experiments and the science and where these could go is all real. And that's, for me, I think what's made me like the show even more is it's sci-fi, it's fun, it's little creepy at times, but it's not just like a completely made up science just for the sake of making it up. They're really keeping it pretty close to the vest on what's actually could happen, or theoretically could happen.
Yeah, because if you couldn't tell by now, we're both pretty big nerds. Not
Hey,
just about TV shows, but just in general. I mean, I'm an engineer by trade in my
he's
day
right.
job. I'm not as cool as Chris is, but so yeah, anytime we get to do a little bit of research while enjoying the TV show to like learn something cool about like a science theory like this, I'm always gonna get jacked up about that. So yeah, I'm right there with you on that. A couple things for everybody to watch out for in the next few episodes that we've noticed. Two main ones, but the first one I can use as a segue because, like I said, one of the other shows we watched from Apple TV was The Changeling, and they actually drop a little reference to that in this last episode, in episode 4, about Alice with the book she had being about the Changeling, and she mentions uh, sacrificing the child to
Bring the mother
get the
back.
mother back. Yeah, bring the mother back.
Right.
Historically and in the stories, that's not really the case, but we have a pretty strong feeling about how that could be tied in. And Chris, I'll let you take it because this was kind of your little theory on this one.
So we already talked about the fact that there's few people that are alive in both realities at this point. And when they brought the Changeling up, to Rob's point, the lore of the Changeling is that, these trolls or fairies take a baby and they disguise themselves as that person's baby. The human baby goes off into the troll land, and, the troll itself stays behind. And in order to get your baby back, you have to torture or kill the troll. And then the creatures bring theirs back because they don't want you to kill the troll baby, and you get your baby back. That's not what this happened here. They brought it up as burn the baby to bring back the mother, which is not what you get through the lore. But what that seems to mean is that, at least for me, I think that Joe sees Alice from not her universe, the one that's not speaking Swedish, that Alice, as a changeling, not in like the troll sense, like the lore of mythology like that, but she just sees her as an imposter child. And I feel as if because there's two of them, Joe is going to have to choose which one stays, and it may mean that she has to delete the other one, unalive the other Alice.
That's a good algorithm safe word there. Thanks,
Yeah,
Chris.
she has to delete or unalive the
Delete.
other Alice because I most likely you can't have two of the same particles in the same space within
Right.
their form. Like I said, the superpositions allow them to be in different states, but once they're there, you can't have them sitting in the same space. So you're most likely going to have to not have one. And I think that's what they were alluding to when it comes to the Changeling, that we might have to see this sort of thing go on later on. But there was a few other things that you guys should notice, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff, and we wanted to get an episode out for 1, 2, and 3, but we got caught up, so we're doing 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it's a huge amount of information, and we probably would have went about this a little bit differently. But there's definitely a lot of stuff to notice that was fun, and part of that is the cabins from the opening scene. At least to me, pretty clearly a symbolism of the experiment itself. If you were to look at the cabins from like a drone view, you'd see one on one side, nothing in the middle, and then the cabin on the other side, which is pretty much what you see from the results from the Cal experiment. And you're seeing reality A on one side, reality B on the other, and the snow that stops is the liminal space in between. So the liminal space, if you don't know, is the space in between realities. It's that little bit of gap. So when you hear it in the show, or you hear us say it in this show, it's the space between realities, that a foot in both worlds kind of thing, where you would say your kids, too old for this and too young for that, and they play in this middle area. That's that liminal space.
Yeah, and within those cabins, we know everybody and their doppelganger saw it, but they've got one painting when the first time we see the cabin of the angel gripping the two staves. And in the other cabin, when she gets there, we see a demon-like figure only gripping the one staff. And obviously, they put it right in our face. We know it's a key symbol for what's going on, and we think we've kind of nailed down, at least at a high level, what this is representing too. And again, it has to do with the particles and being in kind of that in between space where they're not the observer. Chris, I'll let you again. Chris does a lot of real deep dive research and gets some theories together on the top of his head. So I don't want to take credit for his stuff. I don't want to take credit for it. That's why. So
Chris needs to get
I'll let you nail down. I'll
yeah.
let you nail down what that means, and then we'll let you get out of here.
So there's the two paintings. One is the angel with the blindfold on, and that's the most telling part. There's a painting with an angel with holding onto both rods with the blindfold on, basically living in both worlds at the same time. She's holding onto both realities, and she's not looking. So you can have two realities because there is no observer yet. That painting is showing that that painting is the superposition painting, and then we're going to look at the non-super, like after the observer effect. The demon is looking directly back at the person carrying them, which I guess you could look at as time or the universe or whatever is pushing this reality along. It's looking back, and if you look, the demon or the devil or whatever is now sitting on one rod. So it's made its choice. It's picked a reality. It's no longer in a superposition, and it's a direct.
It's being observed.
It's being observed, and it is observing. And
yes,
now we're seeing this other one. But interestingly enough, and I didn't catch it till like the second watch through, so maybe everyone else saw it. In the last zoom in scene of episode 4, the painting looks totally different. It's not anyone carrying anyone. It's the demon standing in a kitchen with two people, which I'm assuming is kind of like Magnus and Joe. And there's a table there, and it's kind of blurry, and I've lightened it up here, but it's a complete change from the other two paintings. So this painting is kind of telling us the story, it seems, of kind of what's happening.
And the last thing we were going to talk about this week, we decided we'd rather hear your opinion on this. So at the end of the episode, the 2 recordings that Joe gets, we want to know what you think of. How do they get these recordings? How do they know what's going on? To drop your answers for that, leave a review on Spotify, drop a comment under the YouTube video, find us on Twitter at crappy_reviews, or even Instagram at crappyreviews2023, and let us know the answers. While you're there, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to grow the Crappy community. Thank you for listening to Crappy Reviews with Chris and Rob, and we'll catch you on the flippity flop.